It was a cold, rainy night in Kentucky, and the world outside seemed wrapped in a thick blanket of darkness. John Harper sat alone in his truck, gripping the steering wheel as the windshield wipers worked tirelessly to keep up with the downpour. The rhythmic swish-swish was almost hypnotic, but it couldn't drown out the thoughts swirling in his mind. John had been driving trucks for over 10 years now. For him, life on the road wasn't just a job. It was an escape. After losing his wife to cancer 5 years ago, he'd thrown himself into work, spending more time behind the wheel than anywhere else. His truck became his home, the highways his refuge. It was easier this way, he told himself. No attachments, no expectations, no heartbreaks. But tonight felt different. Maybe it was the storm, or maybe it was something deeper, a feeling he couldn't quite put his finger on. As he drove past a dimly lit gas station, his headlights caught sight of two figures huddled under the awning. At first glance, they looked like shadows, barely visible against the harsh glow of the flickering neon sign above them. But when he slowed down, curiosity got the better of him. He pulled over. Stepping out of the truck, John grabbed his jacket and zipped it up against the biting wind. The rain soaked through his boots almost instantly as he walked toward the strangers. Up close, he could see that one of them was a woman. Her hair plastered to her face, her clothes drenched and clinging to her thin frame. She held onto a small boy tightly, shielding him from the worst of the weather. Their eyes met briefly, and John saw something there. Fear, exhaustion, and maybe even a flicker of hope. "Hey," John said softly, trying not to startle them. "You folks okay?" The woman hesitated before answering. Her voice trembled as she spoke. We're fine," she lied, though her shaking hands and weary expression told a different story. The boy clung to her leg, peeking out shyly at John. He couldn't have been older than 6 or 7, his wide eyes filled with a mix of fear and curiosity. John glanced around. There were no other cars in sight, no signs of help coming any time soon. Something about their situation tugged at him, stirring emotions he'd buried long ago. He knew what it was like to feel lost, to be desperate for a lifeline. And despite his usual reluctance to get involved, he couldn't just drive off and leave them here. "You need a ride somewhere?" he asked finally, surprising even himself with the offer. The woman blinked, clearly taken aback. I don't want to bother you," she stammered. "We've already caused enough trouble." "No bother," John replied firmly. "Get in the truck before you catch pneumonia." For a moment she hesitated, weighing her options. Then with a deep breath she nodded. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice breaking slightly. "Thank you so much." Helping the boy climb into the passenger seat, John noticed how light he felt, as if he hadn't eaten properly in days. The thought made his stomach churn. Once everyone was settled, he cranked up the heater and handed them a couple of old blankets he kept in the cab. The warmth seemed to ease some of the tension in the air, but the silence between them was heavy. As they drove, John stole glances at his unexpected passengers. The woman stared out the window, her jaw clenched tight, while the boy leaned against her, half asleep. They looked like survivors, people who'd been through hell and didn't know if they'd make it out alive. Whatever their story was, John could tell it wasn't a happy one. He cleared his throat. "Where are you headed?" he asked, keeping his tone casual. The woman turned to look at him, her eyes wary. "Anywhere safe," she admitted after a pause. "We've been running for a while now." "Running?" John frowned but didn't press further. Some questions were better left unanswered, for now at least. Instead, he focused on the road ahead, letting the hum of the engine fill the silence. He didn't know it yet, but this simple act of kindness would set off a chain of events that would change all their lives forever. Little did John realize the lonely road he'd grown so accustomed to was about to take a sharp turn, one that would lead him straight into the hearts of two people who needed him more than they could ever say. As the miles rolled by, the tension in the truck began to ease ever so slightly. The woman and the boy were still quiet, but the warmth of the heater and the steady rhythm of the tires on the road seemed to calm their nerves. John kept his focus, on driving, glancing occasionally at them through the rearview mirror. He wanted to ask more about their story, but he didn't want to push too hard. Instead, he decided to start with something small. "You hungry?" he asked, breaking the silence. "There's a diner not too far ahead. Decent burgers, if I remember right." The boy perked up at the mention of food, his big eyes lighting up for the first time since they'd gotten into the truck. The woman hesitated, her hand resting protectively on the boy's shoulder. I don't want to trouble you," she said, her voice soft but tinged with uncertainty. "No trouble," John replied firmly. "You've got to eat, right? Besides, I could use a cup of coffee myself." She nodded slowly, gratitude flickering across her face. "Okay, thank you." When they pulled into the diner's parking lot, John noticed how the woman scanned the area carefully before stepping out of the truck. Her movements were cautious, almost like she was expecting someone, or something, to appear out of nowhere. The boy stayed close to her side, clutching her hand tightly as they walked inside. It was clear that these two had been living on edge for a while now. The diner was cozy, with checkered floors and booths that smelled faintly of grease and coffee. A waitress greeted them with a friendly smile and led them to a corner booth. John slid into one side while the woman and the boy sat together on the other. For a moment, they all just looked at the menus, avoiding eye contact. But the boy couldn't resist pointing excitedly at the picture of a cheeseburger on the laminated page. "I'll have that," he declared, his voice full of enthusiasm. John chuckled. "Good choice, kid. Make sure you save room for pie. They've got cherry and apple tonight." The boy's eyes widened. "Pie? Really?" "Really," John confirmed with a wink. As they waited for their food, John tried to make conversation. "So," he began, keeping his tone light, "how long have you two been traveling?" The woman fidgeted with her napkin, her gaze dropping to the table. "A few days," she admitted quietly. We had to leave quickly. Didn't have much time to plan." John nodded, sensing there was more to the story, but deciding not to pry. "Well, you're safe for now. That's what matters." Her lips pressed into a thin line, and for a moment it looked like she might cry, but then she forced a small smile and reached over to ruffle the boy's hair. "Yeah, safe." The food arrived soon after, steaming plates of burgers, fries, and milkshakes. The boy dug in eagerly, his earlier shyness melting away as he devoured every bite. Watching him, John felt a pang of nostalgia. It reminded him of his own daughter when she was younger, back before life got complicated and they drifted apart. He pushed those thoughts aside and focused on the present. After dinner, John suggested they stop at a nearby store to pick up some essentials. The woman protested at first, insisting she didn't want to impose, but John wouldn't hear it. "You can't keep going without proper supplies," he said gently. "Let me help." Inside the store, the boy wandered down the aisles, marveling at the shelves stacked high with toys and snacks. John followed behind, grabbing a few practical items, a toothbrush, some clothes, and a warm jacket for the woman, but he also picked up a stuffed bear for the boy. When he handed it over, the child's face lit up with pure joy. "For me?" he asked, hugging the bear tightly. "Yep," John replied with a grin. "Every adventurer needs a buddy." The woman watched the exchange silently, her expression unreadable. But when John caught her eye, she gave him a small, grateful nod. There was no need for words. He could see the weight of everything she'd been carrying reflected in her tired eyes. By the time they returned to the truck, the rain had slowed to a drizzle. The boy climbed into the passenger seat, still clutching his new bear, while the woman settled in beside him. As they drove, the conversation flowed more easily this time. The boy started asking questions about the truck, how fast it could go, how many miles it had traveled, whether John had seen any cool places along the way. His curiosity was infectious, and even the woman joined in, sharing bits and pieces of their journey. "We used to live near the mountains," she said softly, her voice tinged with longing. "Caleb loved playing outside, climbing trees. That Sounds nice, John said, glancing at her in the rearview mirror. What made you leave? She hesitated, her fingers twisting nervously around the hem of her sweater. It wasn't safe anymore, she murmured finally. Things got bad. John didn't press further. He understood that some wounds ran too deep to talk about, especially to a stranger. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to her story than she was letting on. Whatever it was, it had left its mark on both her and the boy. As they approached Lexington, Kentucky, John realized he didn't want to drop them off just yet. Something about their company felt comforting, like a piece of himself he hadn't realized was missing. So instead of heading straight to the shelter, he found a quiet spot to park and turned off the engine. Listen, he said, turning to face them. I know a place where you can stay temporarily, a women's shelter. They'll take care of you until you figure things out. But if you need anything at all, you let me know, okay? I'm not just gonna disappear. The woman stared at him, her eyes brimming with emotion. Why are you doing this? She whispered. You don't even know us. John shrugged, his voice steady. Because nobody should have to go through what you're going through alone. And because... He paused, searching for the right words. Because sometimes helping someone else is the only way to heal yourself. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then the woman nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks. Thank you, she choked out. Thank you for everything. The boy leaned over and hugged her tightly, his little arms wrapping around her waist. Watching them, John felt a lump rise in his throat. He didn't know what the future held for these two, or for himself. But one thing was certain. This chance encounter had already changed something inside him. The days that followed were a blur of activity for John. After dropping the woman and the boy off at the women's shelter in Lexington, he couldn't shake the feeling that his job wasn't done. He'd promised to help them, and promises weren't something John took lightly. So instead of hopping back on the highway and resuming his usual routine, he found himself making daily trips to check on them. On his first visit, he brought groceries, fresh fruits, vegetables, bread, milk, and snacks for the boy. The shelter staff welcomed him warmly, clearly grateful for the extra support. When the woman saw him walk in with bags of supplies, her face lit up with surprise and relief. You didn't have to do this, she said, her voice trembling slightly. I know, John replied with a shrug. But I wanted to. As they unpacked the groceries together, the boy ran circles around the small apartment-like space assigned to them by the shelter. His energy was contagious, and John couldn't help but smile as he watched him play. For the first time since meeting them, John noticed a glimmer of happiness in the boy's eyes, a spark that hadn't been there before. It was subtle, but it was enough to remind John why he kept coming back. Over the next few weeks, their bond deepened. John started teaching the boy little things, how to tie his shoes properly, how to count backward from 10, and even the basics of changing a tire using an old lug wrench he carried in his truck. Each lesson ended with laughter and high fives, and slowly but surely, the boy began opening up more. One afternoon, while they were sitting on the curb outside the shelter, the boy looked up at John and asked, "Are you my dad now?" John froze, caught off guard by the question. He glanced over at the woman who stood nearby watching them. She gave him a small, encouraging nod, though her expression was unreadable. Turning back to the boy, John chose his words carefully. "I'm not your dad," he said gently, "but I care about you, and I'll always be here if you need me." The boy seemed satisfied with that answer and went back to playing with the toy car John had given him earlier. But the question lingered in John's mind long after the day ended. He realized that in some ways he already felt responsible for them. Their struggles had become his struggles, their victories his victories. It was a strange yet comforting sensation, one he hadn't experienced in years. Meanwhile, the woman was beginning to rebuild her life, piece by piece. With John's encouragement, she enrolled in a local community college program to earn her SATYO. Every evening she studied tirelessly, determined to create a better future for herself and her son. John admired her resilience, the quiet strength she showed even when she thought no one was looking. He often stayed late into the night helping her practice math problems or proofreading essays, their heads bent over textbooks under the dim light of a desk lamp. One evening, as they sat side by side working through a particularly tricky algebra problem, the woman let out a frustrated sigh. "I don't know why I'm bothering with this," she muttered, rubbing her temples. "It's been so long since I've been in school. What if I fail?" "You won't fail," John said firmly, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You're tougher than you think. And besides, you've got me cheering you on every step of the way." Her lips curved into a faint smile, and for a moment, the weight of everything she'd endured seemed to lift. "Thank you," she whispered, "for believing in me." Their connection grew stronger with each passing day. Conversations that once revolved around logistics, finding clothes for the boy, navigating welfare paperwork, now turned into heartfelt discussions about their dreams and fears. John learned about her childhood, growing up poor in a small town where opportunities were scarce. She told him about meeting the man who would later become her husband, how she'd believed he was her ticket to a better life until the abuse began. Her voice cracked as she recounted the nights she spent hiding bruises from neighbors, the lies she told to cover up the truth. Listening to her stories, John felt anger bubbling inside him, not at her, but at the world that had failed her. He vowed silently to do whatever it took to ensure she and the boy never had to live in fear again. In return, she shared glimpses of John's own past that he'd buried deep within himself. She encouraged him to talk about his late wife, the love of his life whose memory still haunted him. At first he resisted, unsure if he was ready to open that wound. But eventually, he found himself pouring out his heart to her, sharing memories of happier times and the emptiness that had consumed him after losing her. To his surprise, talking about it didn't make the pain worse. It made it lighter, like finally letting go of a burden he'd carried for far too long. Their friendship blossomed into something neither of them had anticipated: trust. For the woman, John became more than just a kind stranger. He was a lifeline, someone she could rely on completely. For John, she and the boy filled a void he hadn't realized existed. They reminded him of the joy of human connection, the warmth of being part of a family, even if it wasn't the traditional kind. One chilly December morning, as snowflakes began drifting lazily from the sky, John arrived at the shelter with a Christmas tree strapped to the roof of his truck. "Thought we could use a little holiday cheer," he announced with a grin, hoisting the tree inside. The boy squealed with excitement, jumping up and down as John set it up in the corner of their room. Together they decorated the tree with handmade ornaments and strands of colorful lights. The woman stood back, watching them laugh and argue, good-naturedly over which ornament should go where. Tears welled up in her eyes, but they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of gratitude. For the first time in years, she felt truly safe, truly loved. That night, as they sat around the tree drinking hot cocoa, John made a decision. He pulled out his phone and dialed a number he hadn't called in months. When his daughter answered, her voice sounded hesitant at first, but soon, they were chatting like old times. He told her about the woman and the boy, about how they'd changed his life in ways he never imagined possible. By the end of the call, he felt a sense of closure he hadn't known he needed. As he hung up, the woman looked at him curiously. "Everything okay?" she asked. "Better than okay," John replied, his voice thick with emotion. "Things are finally starting to fall into place." Little did he know their journey was far from over. Challenges lay ahead, some bigger than others. But for now, they were content to savor the moment. Together they had created something beautiful. A makeshift family bound not by blood but by love, hope, and the unshakable belief that brighter days were waiting just around the corner. Life at the shelter had started to feel almost normal, or as close to normal as it could be for a woman and her son who had spent months running from danger. John's presence made all the difference. His visits weren't just about bringing supplies or helping with paperwork. They became a lifeline, a source of stability in an otherwise chaotic world. The boy, once so timid and withdrawn, now greeted John with hugs and laughter every time he walked through the door. And the woman, though still haunted by her past, found herself leaning on him more than she ever thought she would. But just when things seemed to be falling into place, the shadows of their old life crept back in. One evening, as John sat with them going over some budgeting tips for the woman's upcoming classes, there was a knock at the shelter's front door. It wasn't unusual for visitors to come by, but something about this one felt off. The staff member who answered the door exchanged a few tense words with the visitor before shutting it firmly and locking it. Her face was pale as she hurried back inside. "He's here," she whispered to the woman, her voice barely audible. "Your ex? He's asking questions." The room went silent. Time seemed to freeze as the weight of those words sank in. The woman froze, her hands gripping the edge of the table until her knuckles turned white. The boy looked up at her, sensing a sudden shift in the air, his wide eyes filled with confusion. John stood up immediately, his protective instincts kicking in. "Where is he?" he asked, his voice low but firm. "Outside," and the staff member replied. "He says he knows you're here. We've called the police, but we can't wait around," John finished for her. He turned to the woman. "Pack what you need, now." She nodded quickly, scrambling to gather their belongings while the boy clung to her leg, whimpering softly. John moved to the window, peeking out cautiously through the blinds. Sure enough, there was a man standing near the entrance, pacing back and forth like a predator stalking its prey. His posture was menacing, his eyes scanning the building with cold determination. "We need to get out of here," John said under his breath. "There's a side exit. I'll distract him while you two slip out." "No," the woman protested, shaking her head. "You can't risk yourself for us." "I'm not risking anything," John shot back, his tone leaving no room for argument. "I promised you I'd keep you safe, and that's exactly what I'm going to do." Before she could protest further, he grabbed his jacket and headed toward the main entrance. As he stepped outside, the man spotted him instantly. "Hey!" he barked, striding forward aggressively. "Where are they? Tell me where my wife and kid are." John planted himself firmly between the man and the door, his arms crossed over his chest. "They're not here," he said calmly, though his heart was pounding. "And even if they were, you wouldn't be seeing them." The man sneered, taking another step closer. "Who the hell are you? Some kind of knight in shining armor?" "No," John replied steadily. "Just someone who doesn't tolerate cowards beating up women and kids." The insult hit its mark. The man lunged forward, swinging wildly, but John was ready. Years of hauling freight across the country had kept him strong, and he sidestepped the punch easily before delivering a solid blow of his own. The man stumbled backward, clutching his jaw, momentarily stunned. Inside the shelter, the woman and the boy made their escape through the side exit, slipping into the darkness unnoticed. By the time the ex-husband recovered and tried to chase after them, flashing police lights illuminated the street. Officers arrived just in time to apprehend him, cuffing him as he shouted threats and curses into the night. When John finally returned to the shelter, his knuckles bruised but his expression resolute, the woman and the boy were waiting anxiously in the parking lot. Relief washed over them as they saw him approach. Without hesitation, the woman threw her arms around him, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you," she sobbed. "You saved us." John hugged her back awkwardly, unsure how to respond. "It's okay," he murmured. "You're safe now. That night." They stayed in a hotel, paid for by the shelter, as a temporary measure until they could figure out their next move. Sitting on the edge of the bed, the boy curled up beside the woman, holding tightly to the stuffed bear John had given him. Despite everything that had happened, exhaustion eventually won out and he fell asleep, his breathing steady and peaceful. Once the boy was settled, the woman turned to John, her eyes red-rimmed but determined. "We can't keep running like this," she said quietly. "Sooner or later he'll find us again." John nodded, his jaw tightening. "Then we make sure he can't hurt you anymore. Legally." Over the next few weeks, John threw himself into helping her navigate the legal system. He accompanied her to court hearings, helped her file for a permanent restraining order, and even hired a lawyer using money he'd saved from years of driving cross-country routes. It wasn't easy. The process was long, frustrating, and emotionally draining, but John refused to give up. For him, it wasn't just about protecting them. It was about proving to himself that he could still make a difference in the world. During one particularly grueling court session, the ex-husband's lawyer tried to paint the woman as unstable, accusing her of abandoning her family without cause. John clenched his fists under the table, anger simmering beneath the surface, but the woman remained composed, answering each question with quiet dignity. When it was finally over, the judge granted the restraining order, forbidding the man from coming within 500 feet of her or the boy. It was a victory, albeit a small one, but it gave them a sense of security they hadn't felt in years. As they left the courthouse, the woman turned to John, her voice trembling with emotion. "What did I ever do to deserve someone like you?" she asked. John chuckled softly, scratching the back of his neck. "You didn't do anything. Sometimes people just show up when you need them most." Her smile faltered, and for a moment, she looked like she might cry again. But then she reached out, taking his hand in hers. "I don't know what the future holds," she admitted, "but whatever happens, I want you to be part of it." John hesitated, surprised by the depth of her words. He'd always thought of himself as a loner, someone who lived life on his own terms. But being around her and the boy had changed him, in ways he couldn't fully explain. They had become his family, not by blood, but by choice. And for the first time in years, he allowed himself to imagine a different kind of life, one where he wasn't constantly on the road, chasing miles instead of meaning. That night, as they drove back to the shelter, the boy fell asleep in the back seat, his head resting against the window. The woman glanced over at John, her expression soft. "Do you think we'll ever have a real home again?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. John smiled, his gaze fixed on the road ahead. "Yeah," he said confidently. "I think we will, together." And for the first time in a long time, he believed it. The months that followed were a whirlwind of change, both challenging and transformative. With the restraining order in place, the woman and her son finally began to breathe easier. The constant fear of being hunted was replaced by cautious optimism. They still flinched at loud noises or unexpected knocks on doors, but slowly they started to believe that maybe, just maybe, they could build a new life. John became more than just a helper during this time. He became their anchor. His truck, which had once been his refuge from the world, now carried supplies, furniture, and even dreams as they prepared to move out of the shelter and into their own apartment. It wasn't much, a small 2-bedroom unit in a quiet neighborhood, but it was theirs. For the first time in years, the woman stood in an empty living room holding her son's hand and felt something she hadn't dared to feel in a long time: hope. "Let's make this place home," John said, setting down a box labeled kitchen stuff. He grinned at the boy, who was already running around the space, imagining where his toys would go. "What do you think, buddy? Cool spot, huh?" The boy nodded enthusiastically, pointing to a corner near the window. "My bed goes there," he declared with authority, making everyone laugh. But laughter wasn't the only thing filling the air. As they unpacked boxes and arranged furniture, emotions bubbled to the surface. The woman paused often, staring at the walls or the view outside the window, tears welling up in her eyes. Each tear wasn't one of sadness, but of gratitude, for freedom, for safety, and for the man who had stood by her side when no one else could. "You okay?" John asked one evening as they sat on the floor eating takeout pizza. Boxes were scattered everywhere, half unpacked, and the room smelled faintly of paint and fresh beginnings. She nodded, wiping her eyes quickly. "I'm fine," she said softly. "It's just I never thought we'd get here. Some days I didn't even think we'd survive." John leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "You're stronger than you give yourself credit for," he told her sincerely. "And you've got Caleb. That kid is your heart walking around outside your body. You did all this for him?" Her lips curved into a small smile. And for me, too, she admitted. For the first time, I feel like I can actually dream about tomorrow instead of just surviving today. As the days turned into weeks, their little family continued to grow closer. John visited nearly every evening after finishing his hauls, bringing groceries, helping with repairs, and teaching the boy how to ride a bike in the parking lot below their apartment. Neighbors began to notice the trio together, and soon enough whispers spread about the kind-hearted trucker who seemed to have adopted a mother and son as his own. One afternoon, while the boy practiced riding his bike under John's watchful eye, the woman stood on the balcony watching them. A neighbor approached her carrying a plate of cookies. "Your husband seems like a good man," the neighbor said warmly. The woman froze, caught off guard by the assumption. She opened her mouth to correct her but stopped herself. Instead, she simply smiled and said, "Yes, he is." Later that night, as they sat together on the couch flipping through channels, she brought it up. "People think we're married," she teased, nudging him playfully. John chuckled, scratching the back of his neck. "Well, I mean, if you want to keep up appearances," he joked, trailing off when he saw the serious look on her face. "I'm not joking," she said quietly. "You've done so much for us, John, more than anyone ever has. And I know it sounds crazy, but I feel like we belong together." John stared at her, his heart pounding in his chest. He'd spent years avoiding relationships, convinced that love only led to pain. But sitting here now, looking at the woman beside him and thinking about the boy asleep in the next room, he realized he couldn't imagine his life without them anymore. "Are you saying what I think you're saying?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. She nodded, her cheeks flushing pink. "I don't want to rush anything, but I also don't want to waste any more time pretending there's nothing between us." John reached over, taking her hand in his. "There's definitely something between us," he said firmly, "and I don't want to lose it." They kissed for the first time that night, their lips meeting tentatively at first, then with growing certainty. It wasn't perfect. They bumped noses awkwardly, and the moment was interrupted by the sound of the boy calling out in his sleep. But it didn't matter. What mattered was the promise behind it, a future built on trust, resilience, and love. Life wasn't always easy, though. Even with the restraining order, the woman's ex-husband found ways to haunt them. He sent threatening letters, made anonymous phone calls, and even tried to bribe acquaintances into revealing their location. Every incident shook them, reminding them that the past wasn't entirely behind them. But John refused to let fear dictate their lives. He installed extra locks on the doors, set up security cameras around the building, and taught the woman basic self-defense moves. "We'll be ready for whatever comes our way," he assured her. "He's not going to win." His words gave her strength, but it was the bond they shared that truly kept her grounded. Together they faced each challenge head-on, supporting each other through sleepless nights and anxious days. The boy, now thriving in school and blossoming into a confident young boy, became their greatest source of motivation. Watching him laugh and play reminded them why they fought so hard, to give him a childhood full of joy instead of fear. One day, while sorting through old papers, the woman stumbled upon a letter from her ex-husband. It was filled with venomous accusations and hollow threats, but instead of crumbling under its weight, she handed it to John with a determined glint in her eye. "Burn it," she said simply. John raised an eyebrow. "You sure?" "Yes," she replied firmly. "That chapter of my life is over. I'm done letting him control me." So they burned it together, watching the paper curl and blacken in the flames of a small fire pit outside. As the ashes scattered in the wind, the woman felt lighter, freer. It was symbolic, not just of letting go of the past, but of embracing the future. By the end of the year, their makeshift family had transformed into something deeper, stronger. John officially filed paperwork to become the boy's legal guardian, ensuring that if anything ever happened to the woman, he would step in as a father figure. It was a decision that brought tears to her eyes and pride to his heart. On Christmas Eve, they celebrated their first holiday in their new home. The tree sparkled with lights, handmade ornaments hung proudly from its branches, and the smell of freshly baked cookies filled the air. As they sat together exchanging gifts, the boy looked up at John and asked, "Does this mean we're a family now?" John glanced at the woman, who nodded encouragingly. Smiling, he ruffled the boy's hair. "Yeah, buddy, we're a family." And for the first time in a long time, none of them felt alone. Years passed, and the little family that had once been bound by desperation grew into something unbreakable. What started as a chance meeting on a rainy Kentucky highway had blossomed into a life filled with laughter, love, and resilience. John, who had once lived for the open road, found himself cherishing the moments spent at home. The quiet mornings drinking coffee with her, the afternoons helping the boy with homework, and the evenings sitting together under the stars. The woman thrived in ways she never imagined possible. With John's unwavering support, she completed her GED and went on to earn a degree in social work. Her dream was to help others who had walked the same painful path she once did, to be the kind of lifeline she desperately needed all those years ago. Every graduation ceremony, every certificate earned felt like a victory, not just for her, but for everyone who had stood by her side. The boy, now a bright and confident teenager, became the glue that held them together. His energy was infectious, his curiosity endless. He loved hearing John's stories about life on the road, often begging him to take them on trips in the truck. "Come on, Dad," he'd say, grinning ear to ear. The word still made John pause sometimes. It wasn't one he'd ever expected to hear directed at him, but it also filled him with pride. This boy, who had once clung to his mother in fear, now looked at John as if he could conquer the world. One summer, they decided to make one of those road trips a reality. They packed up the truck, loaded it with snacks, maps, and a playlist of old country songs, and hit the highway. For 2 weeks, they traveled across the country, stopping at landmarks, eating greasy diner food, and sleeping under the stars. It was during this trip that the boy asked a question that caught John off guard. "Do you think Mom would have been okay without you?" he asked one night as they sat around a campfire roasting marshmallows. John thought about it for a moment, turning the stick in his hands. "She's stronger than anyone I've ever met," he said finally. "But I think maybe we helped each other. She gave me a reason to keep going when I didn't have one anymore, and I guess I gave her a safe place to land." The boy nodded, satisfied with the answer. Then, with a mischievous grin, he flicked a piece of melted marshmallow at John, sparking a playful food fight that left them laughing until their sides hurt. Back home, life continued to unfold in beautiful, unexpected ways. The woman began working at a local shelter, counseling women and children in similar situations to what she'd endured. Her story inspired others, showing them that it was possible to rebuild after trauma, to find happiness again. Watching her transform from a frightened victim into a beacon of hope was one of John's greatest joys. Their bond only deepened over time. On weekends, they took long drives through the countryside, windows down, music blaring. Sometimes they'd stop at roadside diners or explore small towns, creating memories that felt like pages torn straight out of an adventure novel. Other times, they stayed close to home, hosting barbecues for neighbors or volunteering at community events. Their lives weren't perfect. They argued occasionally, faced challenges like any family. But they faced everything together, hand in hand. Then came the day when the boy turned 18. Standing beside him at his high school graduation, John felt a swell of emotions he couldn't quite put into words. This young man, who had once been so scared and unsure, was now poised to step into the world with confidence and purpose. As the boy crossed the stage to receive his diploma, John glanced over at the woman. Tears streamed down her face, but her smile was radiant. "We did it," she whispered, squeezing his hand. "We really did it." John nodded, his own eyes misty. "Yeah, we did." That evening, they celebrated with a backyard cookout. Friends, neighbors, and even some of the shelter staff joined them, filling the air with laughter and chatter. The boy stood up to give a speech, thanking everyone for their support over the years. When he got to John, his voice cracked slightly, I didn't always know what having a dad meant, he admitted, looking directly at John. But now I do. You taught me how to fix things, how to stand up for myself, and most importantly, how to believe in people, even when they don't believe in themselves. Thank you for being my hero. The crowd erupted into applause, but John barely heard it. All he could see was the boy standing there, tall and proud, his future stretching out before him like an endless highway. As the years rolled on, the three of them remained inseparable. The woman and John eventually married in a small, intimate ceremony surrounded by close friends and family. Caleb, now a college graduate working as a teacher, walked his mom down the aisle, tears streaming down his face as he handed her off to the man who had become his father in every way that mattered. Even John's estranged daughter re-entered his life, moved by the changes she saw in him. She attended the wedding, bringing her own kids along. Watching them play with Caleb's nieces and nephews, John realized how much his life had transformed since that fateful night at the gas station. He had gone from a lonely trucker running from his pain to the heart of a sprawling, loving family. Looking back, John often marveled at how fate had intervened. If he hadn't pulled over that rainy night, if he hadn't opened his heart to strangers in need, none of this would have happened. But he didn't dwell on what-ifs. Instead, he focused on the present, the woman holding his hand, the boy-turned-man hugging his own children, the laughter echoing through their home. Life hadn't been easy, but it had been worth it. Every mile driven, every tear shed, every moment of fear and triumph had led them here, to a place where they belonged, together. And as John sat on the porch one evening, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and pink, he knew one thing for certain: sometimes the hardest roads lead to the most beautiful destinations.